This story, titled "My Landlord Entered My Apartment Without Permission, So I Took Him to Court and Got Him Fined," is a wild ride of invasion, courage, and justice. My name is Rachel. I'm 29 and I live in the heart of Chicago. I've always prided myself on being a self-sufficient, level-headed person, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened with my landlord. Let me take you back to where it all began. I moved into my apartment about 2 years ago. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy one-bedroom in a quiet building. I worked hard to make it feel like home, filling it with plants, cozy furniture, and little trinkets that made it uniquely mine. The rent wasn't cheap, but the location was perfect for my job, and I liked the idea of having a landlord who lived nearby if anything ever went wrong. At first, everything seemed fine. My landlord, a man named Mr. Benson, appeared polite and professional. He was a retired contractor in his late 50s, with an easy smile and a reputation for keeping the building well maintained. I thought I'd lucked out with a landlord who actually cared about his tenants. But as the months went by, little things started to bother me. For instance, Mr. Benson had a habit of showing up unannounced. At first, it was under the guise of routine maintenance. He'd knock on the door, toolbox in hand, and say he was there to check the pipes or replace a filter. It felt intrusive, but I didn't think much of it. I figured he was just overly involved in the property's upkeep. But then, things started to get weirder. I'd come home to find items in my apartment moved. Nothing major, but enough to make me feel unsettled. A pair of shoes left by the door would be shifted to the side. A drawer in my kitchen would be slightly ajar. Once, I even noticed my bedroom window blinds had been adjusted. I began to question whether I was imagining things, but the feeling of unease kept growing. One afternoon, I decided to work from home. I hadn't told Mr. Benson, figuring it wasn't necessary. Around noon, I heard the sound of a key in my lock. My heart sank. Before I could react, the door swung open and there was Mr. Benson, standing in my living room. He looked just as startled as I felt. "Oh, I didn't know you were home," he stammered, clearly flustered. "What are you doing here?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mix of anger and fear. "I was just checking on the plumbing," he replied, holding up a wrench as if that would somehow justify his actions. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. There had been no notice, no request for permission, nothing. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was a blatant invasion of my privacy. I told him to leave immediately, and after a few awkward apologies, he finally did. But the damage was done. I no longer felt safe in my own home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and shadow made me jump. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, wondering how long this had been going on. Was this the first time he'd let himself in, or had there been others? The thought made my skin crawl. I decided I couldn't let this slide. I needed to take action. The next day, I did some research on tenant rights in Illinois. What I found was clear. Landlords are required by law to give tenants proper notice before entering their apartments, except in cases of emergency. What Mr. Benson had done was not only unethical, it was illegal. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront him. I knocked on his door the following evening, my heart pounding in my chest. When he answered, I didn't waste any time. "We need to talk about what happened yesterday," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He sighed, as if I was being unreasonable. "Rachel, I was just trying to make sure everything was in working order. You're blowing this out of proportion." "No, I'm not," I shot back. "You entered my apartment without my consent. That's a violation of my rights, and it can't happen again." He looked annoyed, but I stood my ground. Finally, he mumbled something about how he'd be more careful in the future and shut the door in my face. I walked away feeling unsatisfied. His lack of remorse made it clear that he didn't take my concerns seriously, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of it. Over the next few weeks, I tried to move on. I changed the locks on my door and installed a security camera near the entrance. I hoped these measures would give me some peace of mind, but instead, they revealed the extent of the problem. One evening, I came home from work and checked the footage from my security camera. To my horror, there it was. Clear evidence of Mr. Benson unlocking my door and entering my apartment while I was away. He wasn't carrying tools this time, just casually strolling in like he owned the place. He stayed for nearly 20 minutes before leaving again, locking the door behind him as if nothing had happened. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern of behavior. I wondered what he could possibly be doing in my apartment. Was he snooping? Stealing? Something worse? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. The next morning, I took the footage to a local tenant advocacy organization. I explained what had been happening, and they were immediately alarmed. "This is a clear violation of your rights," one of the advocates told me. "You have more than enough evidence to take legal action." They walked me through the process of filing a complaint with the city's housing authority and even connected me with a lawyer who specialized in tenant rights. It was reassuring to have support, but I was still nervous. Taking legal action against my landlord felt like a huge step, and I worried about retaliation. What if he tried to evict me? What if he made my life even more difficult? Despite my fears, I knew I couldn't back down. Mr. Benson's behavior was unacceptable, and I needed to hold him accountable, not just for my sake, but for the sake of any other tenants he might be targeting. With the help of my lawyer, I filed a formal complaint and prepared to take the case to court. When Mr. Benson was served with the legal notice, he didn't take it well. He showed up at my door, banging on it loudly and demanding to talk. I refused to open it, shouting through the door that any further communication needed to go through my lawyer. His reaction was a mix of anger and desperation. He tried to downplay the situation, saying I was blowing things out of proportion and that we could work this out privately. But I wasn't interested in private negotiations. He'd had plenty of chances to change his behavior, and he'd ignored every single one. I wasn't about to let him weasel his way out of this. The following weeks were tense. Mr. Benson started avoiding me altogether, and I could feel the awkwardness whenever we passed each other in the hallway. I kept documenting everything. Every time he entered the building, every odd noise I heard near my apartment door, and any interactions I had with him. My lawyer assured me that all of this would strengthen my case. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. I was nervous, but I knew I had the truth and the evidence on my side. My lawyer presented the footage from my security camera, along with my testimony about Mr. Benson's repeated intrusions. The judge's reaction was immediate and severe. "This is a blatant violation of tenant rights," the judge said, turning to Mr. Benson with a stern expression. "You are not above the law, and your behavior is not only unprofessional, but completely unacceptable." Mr. Benson tried to defend himself, claiming he was only entering the apartment for maintenance purposes. But the judge wasn't having it. "You failed to provide notice, and you have no proof that any of these so-called maintenance visits were necessary. This is a clear abuse of your position as a landlord." In the end, the court ruled in my favor. Mr. Benson was fined a significant amount for his repeated violations, and he was ordered to pay me damages for the emotional distress and loss of privacy I'd experienced. Additionally, he was placed under strict supervision by the housing authority, meaning any future complaints against him would be closely monitored. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I'd stood up for myself and won. Not just for me, but for anyone else who might have been victimized by Mr. Benson's actions. But the victory wasn't just about the money or the legal win. It was about reclaiming my sense of security and showing myself that I was capable of standing up to someone who had tried to take advantage of me. In the weeks that followed, life started to feel normal again. I celebrated the win with friends who'd been incredibly supportive throughout the ordeal. I also made the decision to move out of the apartment. Even though Mr. Benson was now under strict supervision, I didn't feel comfortable staying in a place where my trust had been so thoroughly shattered. I found a new apartment in a different part of the city, a fresh start in every sense of the word. As I unpacked boxes and settled into my new home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. My new landlord seemed kind and respectful, and I made sure to ask plenty of questions about tenant rights during the lease signing process. Looking back, I'm proud of how I handled the situation. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when I doubted myself, but I'm glad I didn't let fear or intimidation hold me back. Mr. Benson had crossed a line, and I had every right to stand up for myself. To anyone watching this who might be dealing with a similar situation, let me say this. You are not powerless. You have rights, and there are people and organizations out there who will support you. Don't let anyone make you feel like you have to tolerate behavior that makes you feel unsafe or disrespected. Thank you for watching my story. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Until next time.